So I'd like to take you down the rabbit hole of diversity terminology, and this presentation is built in and around my master's research, which I did last year, which was speaking to two small presses and speaking to the authors of difference, so diverse authors published by those two presses. And one of the questions I asked them was what their opinion was of different diversity terminology, and you will hear why that question in my master's research came about. So my background is that I've been a bookseller, I'm a writer, I'm an editor, I've been in and around publishing in many ways for many years, and the purpose of my master's research was in order to work out what strategies small presses are already using to publish diverse authors. What are they already doing at every stage of the publishing process to then develop that as a list of techniques that other publishing houses could take up if they also wanted to successfully publish those voices and amplify them in our publishing spheres. So I'm going to set us up with 3 quotes, which I'd like you to consider as the triangular bounds of this talk. So why is diversity in books important? It is not important, it is reality. This is by a queer Asian American writer, Malinda Lo, who I believe just won a National Book Award. This is from about 2015, she said that. Number 2, I wish I could tenderly lift from the dark side of history voices that are anonymous, slighted, inarticulate. And that's by US poet Susan Howe and quoted by a small press scholar. And for many people, this is what small presses aim to do. They aim to find voices that are anonymous, slighted, inarticulate. But then the 3rd one I would like you to consider is who does the naming? Who is naming who is anonymous and slighted and inarticulate? Who is being named and what difference does it make? So very potted background for what my research was. The 2 presses I spoke to were Spinifex Press and Wild Dingo Press. I spoke to both of the publishers of Spinifex and a publisher and a staff member at Wild Dingo. I spoke to 2 authors from each press. All of the authors were kept anonymous. Spinifex has been operating since 1991. They've got about 240 titles in print, and they aim to publish innovative and controversial books with an optimistic edge. Wild Dingo has been in operation since 2010. They have over 40 titles in print, and they aim to publish the rich cultural output and traditions of those oft discussed but denied a voice. You can see there's a link to a journal article with my research findings if you want more information, and there's my Twitter handle if you want to tell the world that you're listening to this amazing piece of research. So I'm going to take you into the beginning of my research process. So here I'm going to show you some pieces of my participant information sheets, which were produced for publishing house staff and for authors. So these were the pieces of documentation that got approved by the ethics committee. And first, I'm just going to show you, I'd just like you to pay attention to the highlighted words. So I talk about promoting authors from marginalised backgrounds, and I talk about increasing the number of diverse voices in the Australian book industry. I also talk about working with publishers who have a commitment to publishing excluded voices, and that I invite them to share their experience, strategies and challenges in championing those voices. So that's for the publishing house staff. And then the yellow highlighting, I use the same to give information to authors, but I also say, as a published author with life experience, which are often not recognised in Australia's mainstream, I'd like to invite you to share your experiences, etc. So you can see I've got terminology like marginalised, terminology like diverse, terminology, what else have I got in there? Not recognised in the mainstream. That's the kind of language I used at the beginning of my research project. And the reason I use that language is because it's pretty much everywhere. So here's a few examples. This one is by Teresa Leclerc, who is an Australian-based scholar of Latinx identity and place. If marginalised writers are perceived to be oversensitive, subjective and inconsistent, it makes it easier to dismiss their concerns. Marginalised writers. Then we have from Annemiek Saha and Sandra Van Lente, who published this very significant report on UK publishing, which came out again last year. Publishers recognise that writers of colour in particular have been historically excluded. and some more key language. And this comes from the director of the University of Queensland Press when they won the Best Small Press of the Year award, UQP's commitment to publishing diverse voices and connecting readers with their stories, etc., etc. So the language that I used is in keeping with a lot of mainstream language about diversity. And this is my absolute favorite. So this book here, Blur by Cham Ji Yi, has a little gold thing because it won the Small Press Network's Book of the Year last year, which for this year is being announced this week at the Small Press Network conference. So small press book, prize-winning small press book. And now, if you would like to look at the biography of About Subbed In, which came from inside the book, its program of publications and events aim to elevate the voices of trans people, people of colour, non-binary people, sex workers, women, people with a disability, LGBTQIA+ people, First Nations people, survivors, working class people, and anyone who finds themselves on the margins of the supremely white, cis, heteronormative, capitalist, colonial, ableist, patriarchal hellscape in which we live, which I must say is the best mission of a press that I have ever read, and I find it supremely entertaining and fabulous. So you can see that the language I have used is not unusual and is par for the course. However, here are some responses that I received to it. This is a response I received from an author I invited to participate in my research, but who couldn't in the end because of reasons of time. Your research topic seems to focus on, as you say, marginalised voices and of those who are excluded, etc. I personally do not view myself as belonging in a marginalised or excluded category. So in that sense, it would be difficult for me to say anything in that vein. However, perhaps we could discuss that particular aspect itself. Marginalised as per whom? Excluded from what? I find these ideas eventually feed a victim mentality, and I do not relate to that. So this author is responding to my cover email, which is the same language. And this author, if one looks at this author and reads this author's bio, they are visibly non-Caucasian. Their biography identifies them as having been educated and having worked in other countries in addition to Australia. So from my external point of view, I had therefore presumed that they were counted as marginalised or excluded. And she is most vociferously saying she is not. She is neither of those things. I also had I may as well say it, an ongoing argument with Renata Klein, who was the co-publisher of Spinifex Press, because I stayed with Renata and her partner and co-publisher, Susan Hawthorne, and I did research with them in their home/publishing house for a few days. So this was an ongoing conversation. This is one of the more measured sections of that conversation. I actually have a bit of a problem with saying that, how do you look for marginalised voices? Because it's foreign to me. We don't work like that. I think that would be very patronising, a new form of colonisation. Publishers decide who gets published, and so we kindly select marginalised writers. If we do that, then the power has not shifted. On the contrary, it gets reinforced. At Spinifex, we don't want to be recolonisers. So one of the things I would like you to notice, apart from that very strong discourse linking curation and taste to colonisation, is also that while Spinifex clearly and explicitly chooses marginalised topics, and they were very clear on this when they were discussing things with me, they also claim to not be choosing marginalised voices. And I think there's a real slippage there where those terms get tricky, and I was not able to open that conversation with them. I don't think they were able to see that that was a tricky area, but it's interesting to see this in evidence. And then Renata went on. Now, remembering, Renata and Susan have been publishing for 30 years plus. They have been feminist activists for 40 years plus. They are now in their 60s and 70s, and many women and feminists they've been publishing have also been involved in publishing for that same length of time. So you've got an idea of the demographic and the stature of many of these authors who we're talking about. I think what I love about our authors, and that's why I reacted so badly to the marginalised voices, I love about our authors how many of them, not all, but how many of them are such in-depth thinkers and have been thinking and writing and teaching and publishing for decades of their lives. I have the greatest of respect for these people, and to then be able to publish another book by them is a great privilege. So this is really interesting to read this from women with decades of experience in publishing women with decades of experience in publishing. But this is a very different experience to younger writers who don't have the status quo of international presence, academic titles, professional experience. I imagine, unfortunately, most of my interviewees were women in this demographic, but from my reading, this is clearly not the experience of many younger emerging writers. And one thing I do want to say is, while I'm critiquing what these publishing houses are saying, I'm not critiquing the existence of these publishing houses in any way at all. I have the highest of respect for both these publishing houses and their work, and I think they have done legendary jobs at publishing the people they have published. I was also told that people of colour is a ridiculous importation from the United States. It is hugely marginalising, and it in fact unifies people of all different colours, whether or not their life experiences may have any resemblance to each other. And then, this is from another author, Abigail. As I mentioned, all my authors were anonymised. I certainly want to have those terms applied to my work at all, for the reasons that you outline about giving too much power to the exclusionary forces. So what Abigail's talking about here is that Renata's critique, for example, was that by calling authors marginalised writers, I'm giving too much attention to the powers that marginalise them, rather than giving the power to the authors who are at the centre of their own networks of creativity and strength. And I had shared this with Abigail in my question. But also because I think it does a disservice to the work. For myself, yeah, I write Jewish, but I also hope and believe that I write universally as well. So here Abigail is fighting against being ghettoised by yet another label onto her work. Now, what all of those interviewees said is not new. It is tried and tested, and I've just picked 3 scenic things to put here on the screen to show you. So, for example, Tanya Kanyas, up on the top right, diversity is a white word. If you are not white, then you were declared diverse, and therefore it is white people who have the power to use the word diversity. And she talks in that article as well about how diversity has negated claims of First Nations people in Australia. We then have Sarah Ahmed on the left with that article, The Language of Diversity. And I just want to snippet out a bit of the snippet that's already highlighted and say what makes diversity useful also makes it limited. It can become detached from histories of struggle for equality. That is, the language of diversity has been mainstreamed to such a point that it's become management speak, and it now has no meaning in terms of activism and social change. And then the next one is from poet and editor and PhD candidate, Evelyn Allen-Lewin, who's a young Indigenous woman based in Melbourne. She wrote a whole Twitter thread last year about opportunities she'd received as a young Indigenous woman, which she oughtn't have been offered because she was too young and too inexperienced and too white looking. This was her analysis. And so she talks about, I declined almost all those opportunities. One org I did work with suggested a project I thought could be better filled by another black fella, a dark-skinned black woman I knew. At the time I didn't understand, but the response I was given was a tactful, no, we'd rather you. Had I unpacked that response or known what to look for, I would have understood it for what it was. Basically an implication that I'm a more palatable version of the blackness they want for the brand. So this is talking about diversity, quote unquote, people identified by others as diverse being pigeonholed into what is acceptable diversity and what isn't, the non-threatening kind of diversity. That's an excellent Twitter thread, by the way. I highly recommend reading it. But then I also had respondents who said very much other things. And this is why it was so great that I asked them all specifically what they thought, because they absolutely said things I never expected. So another author, Patricia, well, obviously from the mainstream's perspective, all of those other voices that aren't mainstream are on the margins, you know, pushed out. But I don't have an opinion about that because I think that's just the way it is. So this person has no questioning either of the status quo or of the language around the status quo. And Gloria, another author, so a writer from a small press, unless the publisher has a good network or clique of journos and critics, will never become part of the mainstream. You're always a marginal writer despite your track record of books and awards. So here she claims the title for herself. She is a marginal writer and she sees the impacts on herself as a published writer because of that identity and because of the marginalised press she publishes through. In that, small presses are marginalised from the mainstream publishing system. But then she went on to say, I don't want to hang on to the words difference, marginal, because I think they're disempowering words. If I own those words in my head, it's just for me. They disempower me. You're different. You're already being put to the side. You are marginal. You're ignored. They're defeating me in a way in my headspace. Now, having said that, even if I use the word difference, I would like to keep on using the word similarities and connectivities and interrelationships and kinships, because they are as powerful and they're a balanced difference. And here we're coming explicitly to the theme of this conference, which is the power of words. There you've got an author telling you the words that she wants reinstated to have the power that is due to them. When I was interviewing another one of my authors, I put this question to her: do you have any opinions about the terminology of diversity, inclusion, exclusion, marginalisation? Do you have any reactions? And she had another different response. Well, they do invoke in me a whole lot of feelings, passion and compassion, and that I like to read stories about people who have overcome adversity. I feel, you know, we can all learn from it. The stories of people, of survival, they're inspirational, and that inspires me to live a better life. I'm passionate about those minority groups because I think they all share similar stories. Now, this was absolutely heartfelt. And this woman's expression and her approach to other writers and to her own situation in the ways that she has been excluded and marginalised because of certain of her life experiences, this is the angle she has come to on it. But I know I have been at presentations, particularly with disabled writers, for example, where they're like, don't you dare call me inspirational. I know that these are contentious terms because this is a different way of othering people as well. But here, Helen is using this language because though she wants to identify those people, because then she wants to seek them out. So it's very tricky. It's very tricky. And I don't know if Helen knows that other people would be critiquing her analysis, because she means it in all sincerity. And then this is the final quote from my respondents, from Catherine Lewis, the publisher of Wild Dingo Press. I realise that my passion then and now has always been and always will be to give voice to the voiceless. 100% it's a passion. It's a passion for giving voice to the disenfranchised and the disempowered and those who would be silenced. Now, again, there will be those who say that this is extremely disempowering language, that she is choosing disempowering language to speak about the people she wishes to publish. Whereas what she is doing, I believe, is she's using that as a positive signifier because these are the people she wants to work with. She wants to choose the people whom others have disenfranchised and others have disempowered and whom others have attempted to silence, and she is attempting to do the opposite. But again, very complex, not a simplistic, and again, no questioning Kathy's passion. Absolutely no questioning her passion, not questioning her track record, not questioning her publishing process, that she has done an amazing job to do her work. But as I said, this is a vortex of terminology. So I modified the terminology that I used as a result of all of this feedback and having such a big argument with two publishers for several days. So since then, and I have done this, I have attempted to do this in my life, not just in the thesis project, which is now long done and dusted. I've attempted to bring this in to my manner of speech overall, which is why you keep seeing me do this around diversity. So I use difference instead of diversity. And I use difference meaning nearly different, not bad different. And that comes from Barnes 2016. And also from that Kanyas information that I shared earlier about diversity being from white heteropatriarchal society. And I also use, instead of diverse writers or marginalised writers, I use writers of difference. And there I follow the lead of Melinda Bobus, who has been using terminology like that for quite some time. So then I went in my research and I changed my documentation to match. So this is just the very first line of the interview guidelines that I use for publishers, where I talk about marginalised voices in Australia's book trade. Following that feedback I got, I changed that to voices excluded from or ignored in Australia's book trade, which I felt was a better formulation. But again, this gets very hairy and there's only so many synonyms. One does one's best. Similarly, I changed the guidelines for authors. So I'd like you to look at the green one. You can see where I included this question. Do you have an opinion about the language and terminology? So that was included in both publishers and authors guidelines, which is why I have this data, is because I explicitly asked all these people what they thought about it. But you can see in the blue highlighted question, what strategies would you like to see the Australian publishing industry adopt to provide more space for excluded voices? There are terms that I think are still valid. I think excluded clearly points to the people doing the exclusion. And I think it's important to recognise that exclusion is systemic and systematic, and that it has happened traditionally, and it has happened historically, and it happens continually. And there's only so many ways you can put that all into an adjective and a noun. And this would be my last point here, is given this vortex / quagmire / minefield of terminology and who says what and what they really mean by it, the best advice and the best summary I can come to is, you ask people what they want to be called, and then you call them that to their face and about them. So this quote that I've put up here is from a recent article by Jack Lattimore. He's actually written 2 articles about this year. He's the newly appointed Indigenous Affairs journalist for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. My advice is to get to know the First Nation you have settled on and the neighbouring First Nations that surround you, and continue to work outwards. It's also always good to ask. Blackfellas will tell you if you're willing to listen. Sadly, listening is not common enough. Yet when it comes to the elements of writing, editing, or just talking about blackfellas, it's the little things that are most likely to yank your coattails over your head and deliver a kick up you're due to. No need to explain what that is. And that is my final word. Thank you very much.